Yeah, sorry, you're right. Yeah, sorry about that delay there. So probability, and I was going to write down what I had before. But basically, we assign a number from 0 to 1 to an event. Excuse me. And that's the idea of probability. So what we often can do is we say that 0 is not going to happen. So 0 is impossible. And 1, the event must occur. Now, what we typically do to determine a probability, and one of the techniques we're going to use in this section is use a ratio, a very particular ratio. And we're going to make some assumptions. Events are one thing, but individual outcomes are going to be another thing. And we want to just mention this idea of equally likely. Now, this doesn't mean that an event is equally likely with all the others. What it means is that the outcomes that make up an event, those are going to be equally likely. So what this says is that the chance of any one outcome is just as likely as another. So what we're talking about here, when we say that the chance of any one outcome is as likely as another, for example, for a coin, heads is equally likely as tails. Another way of thinking about this is we're not going to be dealing with like loaded dice. We're not going to be dealing with weighted coins or anything like that when we come up with the probability for events. So the actual outcomes that make up an event, those are going to be equally likely. So another example would be rolling a dice, getting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 are all equally likely. So again, we're avoiding things like weighted coins, loaded dice, those kinds of things. Now, when we talk about events, events might not be equally likely. The outcomes that make up the events are equally likely, but the events themselves, which are accumulations of these outcomes, those won't be equally likely. And we'll get into that. We'll do an example of that in a little bit. So when we calculate probability, we're going to do it like this. So the probability of an event composed of equally likely outcomes. So there's a little bit of notation here, but we're going to represent event with the letter E. And so what this is going to mean is probability. I'll abbreviate probability of event E. What this is equal to is the number of elements in E. I'm going to divide it by total number of elements in the sample space. So it's the number of elements in the event divided by the total number of elements in the sample space. So we're going to look at the probabilities of different events. So any questions about that so far? So for example, let's say we roll a six-sided dice. So let's say we ask the probability, abbreviate probability. We're going to roll this once of rolling 6. So we're going to roll a 6. So the event contains only one outcome, and that's 6. Now the sample space, well, it contains all possible outcomes. Including the outcome we're looking for. So the way we calculate the probability of the event I'm going to use some little extra notation here. We'll take the number of elements in the event divided by the number of elements in the sample space. And so what we're going to get, there's one element in the event and 6 in the sample space. So the probability, it's a number between 0 and 1, it's going to be 1/6. Questions about that? So let's take a look at another one. So that's the event of rolling a 6. And again, we're going to roll this 6-sided dice one time. So now let's ask this question. Probability of rolling an even number. Well, in this case, the event it's going to be 2, 4, or 6. Those are the even numbers that appear on a dice. The sample space, well, that hasn't changed. That's still our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So to calculate the probability of our event, was the number of elements in the event divided by the number in the sample space. We're going to get 3 out of 6, or we can reduce it to 1/2. And again, it's a number between 1 and 10. Any questions about that? Now, it can get a little complicated. So let's say we have something like this. So we roll a dice twice. Well, in this case, let's say we're going to look for the event. The sum of rolls is 11 or greater. So the sum of rolls is 11 or greater. So one thing we can do to come up with this, let's build a chart. It has all the outcomes. And I'll scoot this down in just a second. So let's look at the sum. Squeeze that in there. A little hard to see. We've got our first roll is going to be along the top. Second roll is along the side. So we'll bring this down for now. So we can just add these up. 1 plus 1 is 2. This is going to be 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Then we have 3, 4. 3 plus 2 is 5. 4 plus 2 is 6. 5 plus 2 is 7. 6 plus 2 is 8. And so on. We can just fill this in. There we go. So we're looking for 11 or greater. So we take a look at our problem. We're looking for the probability of getting a sum of rolls that's 11 or greater. So if we take a look at what we've got here, the sample space, well, if you count all the squares, or if you go 6 times 6 using the counting principle, you're going to have 36 in your sample space. So if we look at the number of times we have a sum that's 11 or greater, well, it's only those 3 times. And that's it. So now we calculate our probability. So in this case, the event, again, number in the event, number in the sample space, we'll get 3 out of 36, or 112. Now, let's say we have a different event. And again, it's a number between 0 and 1. Let's say the event is the sum is 7 or greater. So now let's just go back to this chart and look for 7 or greater. Well, in this case, we still have these. These are 7 or greater. We also have these. And we have our 7s. And so now we can count these up. We've got 6, 11, 15, 18, 20, 21. So in this case, the probability of our event, well, again, number in the event, number in the sample space, we'll get 21 over 36, or 7 over 12. And again, a number between 0 and 1. Questions about that? All right. Ah. A little water on that. So it's not the day for the board, that's for sure. So I think I just have to really press down, and that seems to either get it or just move it around. Now, interesting trick. You scribble over this. That kind of worked. Usually it'll remove some of the ink if you do that. Kind of counterintuitively. Pretty sure it doesn't work with paint. Wouldn't recommend this as a solution to removing paint. I think it does work for dry erase markers. Well, it used to work for dry erase markers. Well, we'll have to try to make do, I guess. Huh. All right, well, we'll see how this looks. So let me try a different pen. So we get to this idea called empirical. Ooh. All right. Probability. Now, this is something where we're going to conduct experiments. We're looking for some outcome. So we're going to conduct consecutive experiments. And we're going to count the number of times an event occurs. So the thing about this, and this is the big difference between what we did before. What we did before, these are called theoretical probabilities. And what's important about theoretical is we're able to produce the entire sample space on paper. Here we can't write down into sample space. We observe it. So an example of this might be let's see. Oh, that's cleaning up a little better. So let's say and this might not be the most exciting hobby in the world, but actually, no, this could actually be kind of fun. Let's say you're into cars and you're going to park on the side of the road and just watch cars drive by. And let's say in your community, for whatever reasons, there's only 3 types of paint jobs available for cars. There's red, blue, and green cars. The thing is, you don't know how many of each are there. Now, we're going to make some assumptions. We're going to assume equally likely outcomes in the sense that cars that are painted red, that has no bearing on how often someone goes out and drives. Like we're gonna assume that there's no relationship to the effect of if you have a green car, you tend to stay home. If you have a red car, you tend to drive a lot more. That the paint job on the car has no bearing on the job somebody has or their personal behavior with a car, how often they drive. And so what we're going to do, we're going to try to observe, get an idea how many cars there are out there by just observing them. So let's say you do this. You're there and first car is red. Second car is red. Third car is blue. Then green. And then green again. Blue again. Green again. Red again. Red, green, blue, blue, green, green, green. And then we stop. So this will be our data. So red cars. I'll have to take a look. 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 4 red cars. And then blue. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then green. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So what we're doing, we don't know anything about the sample space. We're just parking on the side of a road, probably a busy road where commuters are, and we're just going to count cars. And we're going to have the sample space we've come up with. So our empirical sample space is the following. The total number of outcomes for cars is 15. And then of that 15, we have 4 red, 4 blue, and 7 green. So to figure out the probability of the event we have red cars, what's the probability of seeing a red car? It's going to be the number of red over the number in the sample space, or 4 over 7. Oh, sorry, not 7, 15. The probability of green is the number of green over the number in the sample space. And we get 7 over 15. And then finally, the probability of blue. Well, it's the number of blue number of the sample space, or again, 4 15. So that's how empirical probability works. We try to essentially assemble our sample space by using the outcomes of our experiments. And what is often recommended here, and you could probably come up with ways where this advice I'm about to give won't work, is it's usually recommended that the more you perform the experiment, the bigger your sample space, the more accurate your results. There could be things that throw that off. Again, we made an assumption of equally likely outcomes. There could come a point where that breaks down for some reason, in ways that we might not realize. Again, for example, let's say someone has red car day. And so people in red cars are not only just doing their usual errands and going to work, but they might be going back and forth for some kind of week-long festival, and that bumps up the number of observed red cars artificially. So there's little things that can throw out our equally likely outcomes, and that could crop up over time. So you have to be careful to make sure as we do these experiments over and over again, that the equally likely outcome assumption we made in the beginning, that still holds. So something to keep in mind. But in the end, for empirical probability, the way we calculate it, it's the number of times event occurs divided by the number times experiment was performed. In this case, the experiment, well, from our cars example, is each time we look to observe a car, that would be the experiment. One performance of the experiment. Questions about that? All right. So the next thing to look at, it's an application to genetics. And genetics is a fascinating subject. And there's all kinds of, when I was working on my degree, they talked about things like epigenetics, for example, and the idea was that your DNA, it's coiled up inside the nucleus of a cell, and there's ways you can make these coils sort of knot. And when they're knotted up, the cell is not able to access those genes. And the idea is that if this happens in gamete cells, these are cells that are basically contain the DNA passed on to future generations. If this happens in gamete cells, then these genes might not be passed on. At least that was the conversation that was happening last I saw. Now, this is a subject that's changing rapidly all the time. but that was a concern then. So just passing that on. So with the genetics, a gene, it's going to represent, we're going to treat as representing a trait. What genes often really do is they represent proteins. A gene will represent a protein, but we can treat this as a gene's going to have an influence on a trait. And then we're going to talk about alleles. And what alleles are, they're versions of that trait. So you could have a gene, for example, that deals with, say, big toes. And you have two versions of this gene, each one we call an allele. And so one allele is that you have a smaller than average big toe. The other alleles, you have a bigger than average big toe. And you have to be careful what size shoes that you're ordering to accommodate for that extra big toe. Now we have this idea called dominance and recessive. A dominant allele will express itself if paired with a recessive allele. So how do these get paired? Well, what we're going to assume is this. Each parent contributes a copy of a gene, which for now we're going to equate to a trait. Again, really a gene, they map proteins is what they do, but we're going to treat them as if they're directly related to, well, one for one with a trait. And parents can have different copies or versions of this gene. So this copy or version could be dominant or recessive. It could be dominant or recessive. So let's say, for example, you have parent 1 and parent 2, and they'll give to their offspring now let's say we're going to go old school with this. We're going to go to where this whole thing sort of started with pea plants. So they're going to give to their offspring a gene for pea texture. So let's say this gene for P texture has two versions or two alleles. Smooth and wrinkled. It could be smooth or wrinkled. Let's label this allele smooth and allele wrinkled. Now, let's say smooth is dominant. So when these two copies get paired up in the offspring plant, this is dominant. So we're going to refer to it as a capital T for dominant texture. And this is the recessive texture. So how does this affect the actual offspring of these two parents? Well, let's say P1 it's going to give as this kind of profile for the gene, because we're going to have two copies of these per parent. And P2, let's say P2 is this. So what they'll do is they're going to give one copy to the offspring. So the parents are always going to have two copies, but they'll each give one copy to the offspring. But here's the part where this gets random. We're not sure which copy they're going to donate. And so this is where the Punnett square comes in. This is like a roll of the dice. We'll have the outcomes for parent one, the outcomes for parent two. So P1, P2. Now, the way we look at this genetically is we assume that, again, each parent has two copies of the same gene. And they're going to pass on one of their copies. So let's say parent one passes on this gene, this copy, and parent two passes on this one. Well, then the child or the offspring will have this pair representing that gene for smoothness. Now let's say parent one passes this gene on, or this copy, and parent two passes this copy. Well, then the offspring will have this genetic profile or genotype. Now again, this parent passes on the dominant version for smooth, and this parent passes on the recessive version for wrinkled. Or parent one passes on its wrinkled copy, and parent two passes on its wrinkled copy. So these are the four possibilities we could have for the offspring. So any questions about that?
We had a question like this on the homework, and I'm just wondering if are we going to figure out like what the ratio of it is?
We are. We absolutely are. So what happens is this. Dominant alleles are expressed they're going to be expressed when we see dominant dominant or dominant recessive. So that means if the offspring has a capital T at all, you're going to have a smooth P texture. But recessive alleles these are expressed only under one condition, and that's when both alleles are recessive, double T. So if we get this or this, we're going to get that dominant smooth trait expressing itself. You have smooth P's. But whenever you see this, this means you're going to have the recessive wrinkled P's. So taking a look at our Punnett square, we can ask this: what is the probability that the offspring will have smooth P's? So this becomes our sample space, and our event will become the collection of outcomes with a capital T. So be number smooth over the number in the sample space, or 2 over 4, or 1/2. So what it's saying is this: if you have a parent plant with both recessive alleles and a parent plant with a recessive and a dominant, there's a 50% chance you're going to get pea plants with the dominant trait. And likewise, the probability of wrinkle, well, that's in wrinkled, and you only get wrinkled if there's 2 lowercase t's. Just 1 lowercase t isn't enough. You need 2. But it turns out it's 2 double T, 4 total. And again, it comes out to 1/2. Questions about that? So any questions about the Punnett square and genetics?
It's really cool stuff.
It's interesting. It's a neat subject, and it's a subject that's always changing. There's a lot of research in this field and some really cool stuff to get involved in. And mathematically, it's very, very complicated. Like, you don't, as far as I know, and at least last time I checked, you don't have, if there are some, I haven't heard of them, but there aren't, as far as I know, you don't have sort of laws of inheritance or gene expression similar to like Newton's laws in physics per se. I got to be careful saying that, because what I'm picturing and what that might mean to another set of ears could be 2 very different things. It's a fascinating subject. It's definitely a fascinating subject, and there's plenty of room, like in last I checked, to get into some really neat mathematics, some really cool stuff. So the last thing to get into, odds. So the thing with odds, we're going to have what's called favorable and unfavorable outcomes. So a favorable outcome, it's just an event it's an outcome that satisfies some event. An event is something that we're looking for, like we want to roll a dice and the outcome, we're looking for an even outcome. And so the event is that's what that is. It's like, this is what we want. We want an even number. And then if it doesn't satisfy the event, it's considered unfavorable. So if you roll a dice and you want an even number, well, anything other than an even number is not going to satisfy the event. So that means everything else becomes unfavorable. So now we can get to the definition of odds. Now that we have these, the way we're going to define odds is this. So odds in favor of E, it's the number of favorable outcomes divided by the number of unfavorable outcomes. And then for odds against E, it's just this flipped around. And that's it. Questions about that? So we're going to revisit a couple examples. And we're going to revisit our examples with rolling dice. So let's say we roll a dice once. And we want the event of rolling 2 or less. So if we take a look at our event, well, there's only two outcomes, 1 and 2. And then the sample space, excuse me, is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So the number of favorable outcomes, well, that's going to be, excuse me, well, it's going to be the same as our event. For looking at the elements and our favorable outcome, it's just the same thing as the event. It's just going by a different name. But for unfavorable outcomes, it's going to be all the numbers that we don't want to see. And there's 4 of those. So if we wanted to calculate odds for E, it'll be the number of favorable outcomes over the number of unfavorable outcomes. And there's 2 over 4. And you can reduce this. I've seen it where they don't reduce it. You could also reduce it to 1/2. And we'll talk about different ways of expressing this. It's not just in fractions. And odds against E, well, that's the number of unfavorable outcomes over the number of favorable outcomes, or 4 over 2. And you'll sometimes see it, instead of calling it 2, you might see it written as 2 over 1. You'll sometimes see it expressed that way. Questions about that? But I've also seen it where they'll just say, they'll call it 2. You'll see that also. So that's the idea of odds. Now, there's different ways odds are expressed. So for expressing odds, so you could see odds of 3 over 2. This could be rewritten as 3 to 2. You'll also see it expressed more concisely using a colon. You'll see that as well. Questions about that? Now, there is a relationship between odds and probability. And the relationship is this. So let's say we have an event. And let's say we have the odds in favor of E is A over B. Then the probability of this event is equal to A over A plus B. Excuse me. In addition to that, if we have the probability, well, then the odds in favor is P of E over 1 minus P of E. So basically what it lets us do, if we have the odds in favor, we can come up with the probability. Or if we're given the probability, we can come up with the odds in favor. Questions about that? Excuse me. So let's do an example. So let's go back to that dice example where E is the event that one roll is 2 or less. So let's start out with odds in favor. Well, again, if we look at our favorable outcomes to calculate this, it was 1, 2, and then our unfavorable outcomes, it was 3, 4, 5, and 6. So that means our odds in favor will be number of favorable odds, number of unfavorable odds. That'll be 2 over 4, or that reduces the 1/2. So again, we're just doing that calculation over again. So in this case, what we can do, this top number is our A, bottom number is our B. So to come up with the probability we can use of getting 2 or less. The probability of this event is A over A plus B, or 1 over 1 plus 2, or 1/3. Oh, Angelique, do you mind if I mute your microphone?
Oh, no.
Oh, no problem, no problem. So that's the probability. Now let's take a look at this from another point of view. Again, our event is the same. We're going to get 1 roll. Two or less. So we're going to now calculate the probability first. So we look at the number of outcomes in our event. Well, 2 or less, that means 1 and 2. And then our sample space, we always need that for probability. At least the probabilities we're calculating here. You might not always get an entire sample space given, for example, your empirical probability. So the probability of the event is the number in the event divided by the number of in the sample space. So this will be 2 over 6. And what do you know it? It is 1/3, just like we calculated above. So this time, this isn't the answer we're looking for. This is how we're going to set up. So now we know the probability of our event is 1/3. Can we calculate the odds in favor? Well, by our formula, these are equal to the probability of the event over 1 minus the probability of the event, or 1/3 divided by 1 minus 1/3. And if this works, we should get that 1/2, because that's what we got before. So this is 1/3 over 2/3. And sure enough, that's going to come out. Well, you can do your fraction division. Nothing wrong about reviewing fraction division. And we do our KFC. We keep the first one, flip the second, change division to multiply. We get 3 over 6, or 1/2. And that's what we had before. And that's it. So any questions about section 12.3? All right. Well, that's it for today. I'll get this uploaded as soon as possible. Other than that, have a wonderful afternoon.